Hey, May. How you doing? What are you wearing? Something skimpy, I hope.
Tony Stark and Peter Parker have one of the best relationships in the MCU with their mentor-mentee situation, but what if things were different? What if Spider-Man was recruited for Captain America's team in Civil War and Captain America became Peter's mentor? How different would the MCU look? What would the fallout be? Could Peter and Steve have as deep of a relationship as Iron Man and Spider-Man? Oh, this is going to be a fun one. Let's get into it right now.
Lordy, can you even see in these?
Yes, I can't. Look, I can't.
I'm going to start off by saying something controversial. I think it makes more sense for Steve to have recruited Peter Parker in Civil War than Tony. I mean, really? Neither of them should be recruiting a 15-year-old to go fight other Avengers with like 1 day notice. But out of the two of them, Cap does make more sense. Here's one of my problems with that whole situation. Civil War sees Tony push for heroes like the Avengers to be held more accountable and to operate with the permission from a governing body of individuals. His guilt over Sokovia is what's driving this. Steve is more of the, hey, I think we should get to decide what's right and have final say over where to go, and the two butt heads. So Tony, who is fighting Steve for defying orders, suddenly decides to go by himself on his own accord to pick up a 15-year-old and fly him to Germany to fight this battle. Isn't that the exact kind of attitude Tony is against? That the Avengers can't just do whatever they want? Look, I get it. It's not the character's decision, it's the MCU's decision. And that was the best way to get Spider-Man into the movie and in Germany. But that's always rung a little false for me. But let's flip the switch. What would make Captain America recruit Peter Parker? Well, I think that's an easy solution. If the Sokovia Accords were about the registration and deployment of superheroes, let's see how that would affect a new hero like Peter Parker. He's one of the heroes who this would have presumably been geared toward, so having an early scene in Civil War where Peter has to register and Captain America is against it could have united the two of them. Also, I know MCU Peter is not comic book Peter, but this could have been an opportunity for the MCU to take Peter's character in a different direction. Spider-Man, at least to me, is always best as a loner. He's dancing to the beat of his own drum, and having a young Peter Parker turned off by the idea of registration and then falling in with Captain America could have been an interesting development that changed everything in the MCU. But let me just briefly say that if done right, the MCU could have done things even more comic accurate. The version I just presented is quicker, but now I wonder if there was a way for the MCU to skew a little closer to the comic Civil War. Imagine if they had the time to start to develop Tony and Peter's relationship, but eventually Peter switches sides like he does in the comic to join Captain America. That actually could have been a neat little wake-up call to Tony. Like, sure, Civil War did a good job in making both sides sort of make sense, but I'm of the opinion that Steve was more right than Tony. If Tony and Peter developed a meaningful relationship only for Peter to realize that Tony wasn't fighting for the best intentions, then his switch over to Captain America could have made Tony realize that he needed to rethink what he was doing. I mean, actually, Civil War could have played out very similarly to what we got. Tony recruits Peter, Peter fights in Germany, he crosses paths with Steve Rogers, and the two realize they had similar upbringings by being true New Yorkers.
Where you from?
Queens?
Brooklyn.
And then Peter is taken out of the fight for that third act to happen, and Captain America becomes an outlaw. They could have followed this thread into Homecoming, and it would have created some interesting results. Look, I love Homecoming for its high school-based story, and there is a way to incorporate that stuff, but for this purpose, let's pretend there's more important things to focus on. To fully establish Captain America as Peter's mentor, I think you can do that in Homecoming. Because what's the one thing that Peter wants in Homecoming? It's to be an Avenger, right? He desperately wants to prove himself to Tony that he's ready for the big leagues, even though Tony continues to ghost him. In Homecoming, Peter tries to capture the Vulture by himself because he doesn't think anyone is listening to him, and this will make him stand out. But you could easily change that to where, what if Peter's adamant about hunting down Captain America? So let's say that Spider-Man was on Captain America's team in Civil War. It seems like all of those Avengers got off with some really weird sentences for rebelling, like with Ant-Man and Hawkeye on house arrest. So maybe the fact that Peter is a 15-year-old gets him off with a warning, but now he's in New York and feels guilty. He's unsure about if he did the right thing, so now Peter is adamant about capturing Captain America in order to maybe impress Tony Stark and clear clear his own name a little bit. And they could have some fun bits where Peter does find him hiding in New York. Again, they established that the two have similar upbringings with their New York roots, so maybe Spider-Man can use that to find Steve. Only when they do cross paths, Peter is torn about whether to turn him in or not, and Steve does continue to mentor him from there. I like putting Steve in Homecoming because it sets up two types of mentors for Peter between him and Tony, and could end with Peter realizing he needs to branch out a bit and be his own hero to decide what's right. That does call into question the Vulture's role in Homecoming though, and how much that would have to change. Because honestly, the movie that I'm describing with Peter trying to track down Captain America already seems like a lot. But this is all make-believe. Let's pretend we can do whatever we want. So now the question is, how would Vulture fit into Homecoming's story? Well, much like Zemo in Civil War, maybe Vulture could be the guy both Captain America and Iron Man are after, though both of them being on two sides of the law. And you know what? I'm liking this. Hear me out. So Civil War could have been about the hero's side of registration, and Spider-Man more on Captain America's side now, and then Homecoming could have been exploring how each side would go about capturing a dangerous criminal. Iron Man would be trying to follow protocol under the new Accords, and Captain America would be working as a rogue agent. That makes Spider-Man the wild card, and by progressing the story where Spider-Man is having better results than both Captain America and Iron Man, means that not only could Peter be learning from both Captain America and Iron Man as he's mentored by arguably both of them, but the two main Avengers are also learning from this teenage hero. I think that's the missing ingredient actually, since this way, by pushing Peter as this middle ground between Iron Man and Cap, it frames this as more of a Spider-Man story. It's not perfect, but I think there's a way to make that work. Let's pivot a second and talk about Captain America. This whole time, I've been discussing how being on Captain America's Civil War team would mainly change things for Peter and his character as he learns what he believes is right and wrong. But I feel like I should devote a little time to Captain America. If Spider-Man was Steve's mentee, then that's great for Peter. But how would that be for Captain America? What would Cap be like around a teenager who wants to be a superhero? Cap's two biggest sidekicks are the Winter Soldier and Falcon, but both are grown men who can operate independently without Captain America. They feel more like partnerships rather than the mentor-mentee setup. So what would change? For one, I think there's a lot of humor you could get from Captain America trying to relate to a teenager.
Don't you say it left. Come on!
Especially if that teenager is probably more aware of how the world works technology-wise than you are. And because Peter is smart like Tony Stark, it would allow Steve to mentor the potential next Iron Man and maybe learn more about Tony in the process. Maybe if Steve sees Peter as a mini Iron Man, then that might fix Tony and Steve's relationship faster. There's also something interesting to be said about Captain America training someone with superpowers, since both of them are powered up but from slightly different sources. The question becomes though, if Captain America becomes Spider-Man's mentor, does that affect the other relationships in his life? We know Steve and Bucky grew up together and are best friends, but would Peter intrude on that relationship at all? Same with Falcon. If Captain America had Spider-Man by his side, would that cause a little strife between Steve and Sam? Tough to say, but overall, Captain America has always been a leader, though he's mainly worked with peers. Let's see what happens if we pair him with someone who needs to learn about being a superhero. And honestly, if Peter was on Captain America's team in Civil War, it opens up a lot more potential for fun pairings that were left unexplored. I mean, I'm curious, was there room on Captain America's team for two quirky golden retrievers? Ant-Man fills that role on Captain America's team as the wide-eyed, wow, this is awesome type of character, while Spider-Man does that on Iron Man's team. What would happen if both Ant-Man and Spider-Man were on the same team?
Hey guys, you ever see that really old movie? Empire Strikes Back?
Jesus, Tony, how old is this guy?
I know usually in the MCU, it's best to have one goofy character, one serious character, but put two goofy characters together and you got yourself a party. I think both of them would geek out over being on the Avengers, and you could have a really great scene of Scott and Peter talking about being fans of these heroes for a while, and now they're a part of it, and what that overall means.
I'm shaking your hand too long. Wow, this is awesome.
But a pairing I would actually be really interested in is Spider-Man and Scarlet Witch. One minor nitpick about Scarlet Witch in Civil War is that she's set up as really important in the first half, as she essentially causes the conflict that sets off the Sokovia Accords, but becomes more of a utility player by the end as we shift focus to Baron Zemo, Bucky, Cap, and Iron Man. I know the movie is already super long, but I think it would have gone a long way to see Scarlet Witch interact with someone who doesn't already know her and discuss how the accident was not her fault. Yeah, seeing Clint rescue her from Vision and seeing her scenes with Vision are all great, but I think you could have gotten a little more if you paired Spider-Man with Scarlet Witch. Just an interesting new perspective. So that brings me to Infinity War, and man, that has the potential to look a lot different in this new Spider-Man and Captain America partnership. If Spider-Man has become fully Team Cap at this point, then he probably never gets the Iron Spider, right? I mean, yeah, you could make the case that he never gets the original Stark suit, which would imply that he makes his better homemade costume himself much earlier, which wouldn't necessarily be a bad thing. But without the Iron Spider, then Peter would have fallen to Earth and stayed there during the events of the movie, right? I mean, maybe, but I like keeping Peter on the Titan mission. By making it so Peter does travel to outer space with Tony Stark and Doctor Strange, it sets up a nice conclusion to the arc set up in Civil War, where Peter had to turn against Tony to side with Cap, and now the two are fully working together. Iron Man and Spider-Man could have worked out their differences, and it's there that Tony develops his full respect for Peter. And then, just when Tony is fully in Peter's corner, that's when they lose and Peter turns to dust, which would affect Iron Man in a different way than before. He wouldn't be as devastated as he was in the OG Infinity War, but he would have to return to Captain America and tell him that his protege wasn't there with him. Then that leads us to Endgame, and if we're following this plotline, then Tony would have to return to Earth and tell Captain America, "I lost the kid." That line would carry significantly more impact because it's Captain America with the close connection to Peter now, and Tony would probably feel immense guilt of failing to protect him, and would be left with those feelings of doubt, where Tony would wonder if Captain America was in space instead of him, would Peter still be there with them? Maybe the two heroes could have another falling out over this, and it's only when Ant-Man presents his time travel theory that motivates Iron Man to fix things. Maybe it's a case of Tony having a kid now who he loves more than life itself, and realizing that Steve and Peter had a father/son-esque vibe, so Tony understands more the feeling of losing someone that close to you, and he invents time travel to help his friend Steve. Given Tony and Steve's tough relationship over all these movies, I find the idea that Tony invents time travel to help Steve out pretty satisfying. And of course, Peter would still lose a mentor at the end of the movie with Cap going back in time to be with Peggy. But now it's framed as Captain America being okay with leaving the superhero life because he knows heroes like Peter are there to continue the fight. That would help fix the issue people have with Endgame about how Steve leaving to go be with Peggy felt out of character. I think establishing that Steve trusts Peter to lead the next generation of heroes would fix that nitpick, don't you? Then Spider-Man Far From Home would be the same, but not really. That movie is all about Peter trying to be the next Iron Man before realizing he should just be Peter Parker. And this new version could be similar, with Peter trying to be the next Captain America before realizing that he needs to spend a little more time as a teenager and being his own hero, because that's what Captain America would have wanted. I mean, you could still keep Mysterio, but I wonder if you could make him not another person who hates Iron Man, but rather just a Spider-Man bad guy. Not sure if the movie would be better for that or not. I wonder if a Captain America mentor relationship would mean that Spider-Man would have shown up in Falcon and the Winter Soldier. I mean, that final fight took place in New York and was pretty well publicized. It was kind of weird Peter didn't show up to assist his fellow Avengers, right? But Peter and Falcon and Winter Soldier have an interesting relationship that would have been even more fascinating if Spidey was on Cap's team and was his mentee.
You have a metal arm? That is awesome, dude.
I think Spider-Man would have had more of an opinion about who should have been the next person to hold the shield, and I could see a cameo from Peter trying to convince Sam to take it. Again, it doesn't have to be major, but for how New York that show felt at the end, it would have been perfect for a Spidey cameo. And I think you could make Spider-Man No Way Home make a little more sense as well. You know what's weird? The fact that Peter is upset that him and his friends can't get into MIT, and that's the main reason why he goes to Doctor Strange. But if he was so close with Tony Stark, couldn't Pepper Potts just step in and convince MIT to accept them? I mean, Tony gave them a ton of money in Civil War and was their most famous alumni. Felt like a problem that could have been solved easily, but if Peter was closer to Captain America, who didn't have rich and powerful connections, the idea of his secret identity ruining his life is much more plausible. Then you could still have everything that happens in No Way Home play out mostly the same way. And that brings me to my final point about the future. Overall, what are the broader ramifications for Peter Parker on Captain America's Civil War team? Well, for starters, it would have opened the door a bit for Ironheart earlier in the MCU. Right now, Ironheart is being established as a post-Iron Man hero with Wakanda tech, which is fine because it's not like they could have done the comic-accurate storyline with her being Iron Man's mentee. But maybe they could have if Peter was with Captain America. Then it wouldn't be a rehash of the same storyline. Maybe you could have had a situation where in the 5 years between Infinity War and Endgame, Tony started to lightly mentor Riri Williams, and then you'd have parallels between Tony mentoring Riri and Steve mentoring Peter. And then with both Tony and Steve gone, it creates an interesting relationship between Ironheart and Spider-Man. Both of them would have lost their mentors and created their own special partnership for the future. Alright, I know this was a positively wild ride, but I'm curious what your guys' thoughts are regarding if the MCU could have ever pulled this off. Let me know. Man, quick aside, now imagine if Peter Parker was transported into space and Peter Quill became his mentor as he hung out with the Guardians of the Galaxy. Do you think that would have worked? Or should things just stick with Iron Man? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching CBR.